Want to build a thriving business while making a much bigger impact in the world by becoming known as an influential voice in your industry? The choice versus just a choice with your ideal client? That's exactly what you're going to learn as I interview business experts, industry thought leaders, and entrepreneurs who are in the trenches making their mark so you can too. This is the award-winning podcast, The Ambitious Entrepreneur Show, and I'm your host, Annemarie Cross. Hey, it's Annemarie. Before we go into today's interview, I wanted to let you know that this was an interview that I did, and I was interviewed by the wonderful Kerry West, who is all about helping her clients identify their origin story. So we spoke a lot about the importance of story, origin story, how we can weave that into our marketing and our message to really make an impact in the world. And how many of us, sure you too have thought about this, is what's so good about my story? I can't share my story. Who wants to hear my story? And all of those things that we tell ourselves. And so hopefully the conversation that Carrie and I have will inspire you to get your stories out there, because my goodness, don't we need it? Amongst all the doom and gloom that is going on in mainstream media, gives you an opportunity to share your story of hope, of inspiration, of empowerment to others as well. So without further ado, I want to thank Carrie for interviewing me, for giving me the opportunity and for allowing me to share this with you, my community. And I really do hope that you are inspired and empowered to start sharing your story, if you're not already, from now, because there's someone out there, lots of someones who need to hear your story. Over to you, Carrie. Take it away.
Hello, everybody. I'm Carrie Casey West, and we're here talking story with my dear friend, Annemarie Cross. Annemarie is amazing and has amazing stories that I know you're going to love. But just a little bit about her. She is the CEO and founder of the Ambitious Entrepreneur Podcast Network and an Industry Thought Leader Academy, author of Industry Thought Leader, From Invisible to Influential and Profitable with a Podcast. We know her dearly as the podcasting queen. She's an award-winning podcast host and recognized as a pioneer in the podcasting space, having started her first co-hosted podcast in 2008. I wasn't even thinking about those things back then, but here she is, and she has generously offered to take time to be with us today as we talk about story. Annemarie, from the minute I met you, I love your sense of humor. I love your willingness to be open and available and talk to people. And sometimes I think that's tricky to do on a podcast, because even though we've gotten used to the screens, it's different. But yet you come across so personable on camera, and I love that. Do you think that's what contributed to your success?
Such a great question, Carrie. I remember when I started my very first co-hosted podcast back in 2008, my co-host and I would often laugh between each other because I loved the medium. I was a little bit nervous to begin with. We both were, because it was a new medium. Not many people knew what a podcast was, but our passion and the purpose for starting the podcast, and I can share a little bit more about that in a moment and why we started it, that drove us forward, pulled us forward. But I remember speaking that every now and again he might not be able to come to the show, so I would have to do that on my own. And I was quite happy to do that. And he said, I don't know how you do it, because we would bounce ideas off one another, and it was a great relationship. But I was quite happy to do it on my own, even though I knew that I might not be speaking to anyone. But I am just able to do that. I don't know. It's something, but I do recall, even as a child, I would be speaking into my hairbrush and, just sharing things. So I think it was just something that was innate in me, and I'd been developing it even from a young toddler.
Well, what a great segue. That sounds like a great story. I've talked with you about origin stories, and origin stories to me are vital. If once you know your origin, you really understand who you are today. I firmly believe that. And you just mentioned something that I think it was going to be one of my first questions. So what about your personal origin story led to your business origin story? So Perhaps we should start with how you got started as a podcaster.
So
If
back then in 2008, I was working in the career industry. So I was a career coach and consultant working with executives right through to even graduates, people who are just at the beginning of their careers. And around that time, if people can remember, it was when the global financial crisis hit. And I'd been very fortunate enough to secure a contract working with a large, he called it career ladders over in the States. And I remember working with senior executives who are now wanting to go for jobs that were paying like between $2 and $4 and $8 an hour. It was just horrendous. Anyway, we knew that things were difficult. We knew that things were tough. We knew that things were different. But the doom and gloom that continued to be portrayed across every mainstream media, we noticed was really impacting the psyche of our clients, the people that we would speak to. And so my colleague and I said, we really need to do something because as career specialists, we knew that while things were difficult, they weren't impossible. We just needed to change our approach to job seeking. And we certainly needed to be mindful of what were we telling ourselves, because that was going to impact how anyone would show up within an interview or even go looking for opportunities that weren't necessarily advertised. So we said, let's start an online radio show. Yes. How are we going to do it? Have no idea. So, anyway, that kind of passion to be that voice of hope and inspiration amongst the doom and gloom drove us forward. And it actually continues. I see that woven in what I do even today, because as I'm sure we would all agree, mainstream media is not really all about sharing stories of origin and hope and possibility, but they're really good at highlighting the things that are going wrong. And I even see there's a real, what I call almost like a fear campaign that mainstream media often goes towards, because guess what? That fear and all of that controversy sells. And I see myself as sharing the airways, but bringing hope, bringing possibility, because there is always hope and there is always possibility. The difference is, are we going to see the opportunities there, or are we going to allow ourselves to be suppressed and oppressed by the negativity? So that's why I use the podcast platform today. And it's an incredible medium to be able to share stories, as I'm sure you're well aware of now too.
What's your favorite origin story of somebody you've had on? Because I'm sure people tell you their story, especially in business, how they got started. Do you have a
Yes.
favorite?
There are so many, but one that comes to mind and one that I've often shared over and over again is when I was interviewing a young woman who was sharing her story, and I had no idea that this was the story that she was telling me. And often I'm so glad that I'm trained as a coach as well, and a counselor, and so I was able to, and I'm sure you've heard the term, if you're a counselor and a coach, hold state, if that, rather than all of a sudden thinking, oh my goodness, because their story was just so heartbreaking. Anyway, she told her story, was that a young child, she was gang raped twice, and she was left along on the side of the road, left for dead. Anyway, long story short, she managed to get help, but as a teenager and then as a young woman, she continued to, deal with her grief and her loss. And one of her dearest friends would often say to her, "You need to go and share your story." And she said, "Well, why would anyone want to hear what has gone on with me?" Anyway, her friend continued to press her, and she thought finally, okay, I'm going to go and share my story. This was before she got really proactive and in realizing, oh my goodness, my story can really help others. So she went to the very first event that she spoke at, and it was for, if I recall correctly, a woman's shelter. And so when she was sharing her story, she was recalling that there was not a dry eye in the building after she'd finished. And there was a long queue of people who were lined up wanting to shake her hand and so forth. But there was one woman at the corner of her eye that she could see who was really crying quite uncontrollably. And as she got closer and closer and closer, and finally she was in front of this woman, and my guest said to her this at the event, "Look, that's okay, you're going to be fine." She says, "You have no idea on how you sharing your story has impacted my life." She said, "I'd made a decision this morning that I was going to end my life, but something drew me to come and listen to you. And she said, and now I've made another decision that my life is worth it and I'm going to get the support that I need. And it was then that my guest said, oh my goodness, through me sharing my story, she was able to transform and empower someone to change what could have been a life, changing or life threatening decision. And she then thought, my goodness, my story is much bigger and I have to go and share that. So I often will share that with others who think, who would want to listen to my story? My story's not this or not that, but every single one of us has a unique set of circumstances. And some of those circumstances, or most often those circumstances, are heartbreaking experiences. But we've gone through that. We've grown through that. Our character has been shaped. And through sharing just snippets of that and what we did and that opportunity of hope, possibility, and where we are now will give someone the thought that, hang on a minute, or planting the seeds that that's possible for them. It may be possible for me too. And that just could change the course of someone's life. So share your story, I say, because you just don't know who it'll impact and the lives that it will change, which is absolutely true, isn't it?
Oh my gosh. It's, we don't realize that we are so much more alike than we are different. And when we share these experiences, they can only help somebody else. Because sometimes when you have trauma, I suffered from a lot of trauma myself, and you feel so alone. You feel so alone, and you don't have anybody who would understand. My parents never understood, I had nothing, and I too almost considered ending it all. But perseverance and getting through it helped, and hearing other stories. And so I'm grateful that you got this young woman to speak about her story and tell people. Beautiful, beautiful. My heart is just pounding here because that was such an important story. Thank you for sharing that one. Whew. So on a lighter note, um, you you talked briefly about how as a child you just loved, for getting in front of people and talking. What is your personal origin story, and how do you think that relates to, I suspect, based on what you've said for your story about how you got into podcasting, but what do you think drew you to podcasting? Do you see a connection between your origin story, your personal one, and how that opened up this wonderful career and lifestyle for you?
It's interesting you should say that because if I look back throughout my childhood, I was adopted, and so my first beginnings right back was 3 months in a nunnery, and so there's an incredible story around how my biological mother gave me up, and she said, look, I would rather that she not go into a Catholic but a Protestant family. And then my mother, my adopted mother, who was looking for to adopt this young child, they'd immigrated from Holland to New Zealand, and they'd always spoken, my dad and my mother had always spoken about adopting a child when they came to New Zealand. I had three older brothers, and anyway, they'd forgotten about that dream. Finally, they were looking, and she was looking, gone everywhere around New Zealand to the different adoption agencies and so forth, couldn't find any young, daughter or young baby girl. And so, just kind of out of desperation, she knocked on the door of this Catholic nunnery, and she said, look, I'd have to be honest to this nun who came and spoke to her. She said, I'm not Catholic, I'm Protestant, but we're looking to adopt and open our home to this young child. And the nun said to her, well, it's interesting. It's funny you should say that because we have got this young girl whose mother actually had said that. And so I'm a Christian, so I know that there's no such thing as serendipity. I believe that it is from the hand of, the living God. So anyway, that's kind of how my story started and how my journey started. So I have the ability to see nature and nurture at play. I have met now my biological mother, and I've got great relationship. My adopted parents are now have now passed on. But yeah, I mean, just the learning and growth, as a young child who was adopted, there's things that you need to go through and experiences. So I was always curious, still am, and probably why I love podcasting, because I have the opportunity to learn and grow and develop from every story that someone shares. And so, as a young child, I would often research things and want to know how things were created and how does this work. And of course, we didn't have the internet back then. So, a lot of it was through books and through teachers and people that you would meet. And so, I think that curiosity and that ability to learn and not have judgment against, other people. You know how sometimes we do that, we put filters on. I've always gone, well, that's curious. What makes someone do that? So, that has really set me on this journey of learning. And so when we realized, fast forward, that there was this opportunity to use this medium that would allow us to interview others and learn and grow from them. I mean, I just never looked back. But there was one other story that was in my journey as a teenager that was really impactful for my life and set me on the direction to where I am today. I always thought that I would be a teacher, and here's why I shared the adoption story was because my biological parents, my father and my mother, were teachers, and my family, my adopted family, they are all teachers too, from kindergarten teachers right up to professors in a theological college and in between. And so at the age of about 15, 16, when I was in high school, I fell off my horse and I was concussed. And so I could not think. And so I spent about 6 to 9 months going to hospital to get treatment for loss of memory and concentration. And at the end of that year, my mother said, look, rather than returning to school, if you want to go and get a job and then go to night school, which is what I ended up doing. And so I didn't go to teachers college, which was my original life plan. But it was interesting because I started working in an office, and the job that I thought that I would never do at school, I thought I'll never work in an office because I think I would not enjoy it at all. But I had taken accountancy and bookkeeping, secretarial practice studies just in case. But those just in case topics ended up supporting me in getting into an office as an office junior. And I realized I loved it. I loved learning so much so that I got 2 or 3 pay rises in amongst, 2 or 3 months, never told my mother because I knew my board would go up. But anyway, so I realized, and then from that, I also continued night school and I did more accounting and studies. And then that led to learning more about human resources and then counseling. And that just continued to grow. And one of the questions I'd always asked myself was, if I hadn't had my accident, would I still be doing what I am doing today? And I realized when I'd gone full circle, when I became a career coach, because as part of that, we'd have to do a lot of certifications, a lot of understanding about personality and behavior, which was just so fascinating for me. What makes us as humans click? And then I realized going full circle, going through all of those, personalities and certifications and so forth, which I would use with my clients, that I was in the right place. And had I gone into the path that I had originally thought, which would see me to become a teacher, I would have been burnt out, because I realized that I'm also an introvert. I love the podcasting and speaking in front of a microphone, but when I'm on my own and I need to, recuperate, I'm also an introvert, which means you can't really be associated around a lot of people. And in a classroom environment, you're dealing with a lot of these incredible young, boys and girls, no matter what age, or teenagers. That would have worn me out really quickly. But teaching and mentoring and coaching with adults within my own business was suited me perfectly, because I got to teach, got to help people, excel at whatever they were doing, find new jobs at that stage, and be able to do it in my own setting and environment, which suited me best. And so, yeah, long story short, that accident was the best thing that could have happened to me, because it really set me down the path which I am on today. And it was the best path for me and who I was and what I believe I was created to be. So there you have it.
how fascinating. What a direct connection to how our stories are interwoven. There's no accidents that the way these things come together. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it because, as you know, these interviews are going to be used as a library for people to get an idea of how origin stories play out in their lives. And you just have the perfect example of how our origin stories are related. When you can tell as a former HR person or a current HR person or an HR person, you see how people's personalities come from their stories and how that attracts them to certain type of work.
Yeah.
There's a direct correlation to how those work together. And
Yes.
you've just said it perfectly. Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Well, I
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing your story with me. Do you have any other stories you want to close with? You don't have to. If you just want
Look,
to.
yeah, look, you said something earlier, and I think that that is so important. Often when we go through circumstances, we can feel alone, that no one else has gone through that, which when we start to realize and hear other people's stories, other people are experiencing it too. I'm not alone, and there is a way forward. And one of the other stories that I will often tell, and I think each and every one of us, you talk about origin story, which I absolutely love. But then, each of us have incredible learnings and lessons that we can share with people and weave into our story, from the origin story right through to our triumph story. And one of the other stories that I often share, because I've learned so much from that, is the story where I talk about my worst business failure ever was actually the best thing that ever happened to me. And the reason I say that is because I learned so much from that failure, that the gifts that just keep on coming from that. But every one of us can have a story, or has a story of where we've failed. But often the difference between that story becoming the best thing that could have happened to you is how you approach that. And so I know that so many of us in businesses, when we hear there are, because of what's going on in the world today, there are a lot of sad stories of loss, stories of failure, and so forth. And we can often end up feeling so hopeless that we give up. But, move forward through that, because there is always a way, there is a path. I started Women in Leadership podcast, which is one of my other podcasts, after that experience, because I recognized I was burnt out. I couldn't create, couldn't put things together, which was something that was very much innately one of my gifts and strengths. But because of that failure, and so 3 episodes in, after Women in Leadership was launched, and it was started with a way to deal with my grief and loss, because I thought, I'm going to surround myself with incredible women. I'm going to hear their stories. I'm going to ask the questions, which were really, for me, what did they do when they experienced hardship, and what were the steps that they took? So that's why I started Women in Leadership podcast. But 3 episodes in, I accidentally generated 2 4-figure clients, which was, I say accidentally, because going back to Career Success Radio, which was the podcast I started in 2008 with my co-host, whilst it had built influence, whilst it had built impact, and we had an incredible network of people around the world and listeners who very much loved our content, we struggled to monetize it. Podcasting was quite young back then, so we didn't have a large audience, but we didn't realize back then, and we do now, that we don't compare podcast audience to mainstream media audience, who really, mainstream media and radio, advertising and sponsorships are really the main source of revenue generation. We didn't realize the gift in a smaller niched audience, and so much more. And it was off the back of Women in Leadership that I thought, if I could do that accidentally, what would be possible if I backtracked the steps? What was in place for Women in Leadership that hadn't been in place for Career Success Radio? And I was able to backtrack that, set up the steps, and actually document them, and now create a whole training course around that. And I share that because some of your listeners may just be sitting on incredible opportunities to birth something, if I may use that term, off the back of, the steps that they took, the learnings that they took, the growth that they took, because some other people are waiting to hear that so that they can implement the same. And it can become the cornerstone of your teachings, your stories, the inspiration and the empowerment that you share. So, be courageous. We have to be courageous. I remember one gentleman, when I shared my story with a colleague, who said, "You need to share this." He messaged me privately and he said, "I just want to let you know that I think you're very courageous." He says, "I've got many stories of, failure, but prior to hearing you, I would have been quite ashamed." But you know what? And this goes back to what you said. Don't be ashamed of what you've been through, what you've experienced, and what you've worked through, because it's a learning, isn't it? It's a learning, it's a growth, and it can now be the foundation upon which we stand and we step up to the next level and the next level. And guess what? We can then reach out our hand behind and pull up others alongside us to say, "You've got this. I've done it. These are the steps that I took. Follow me, take these steps because this will help you through that." And we can share that. And how awesome it is that we get to use a podcast and other technologies to be able to share our origin stories and our success and our failure stories as well, and celebrate them all.
I I have to tell you, you're talking my language. You're talking my story. I went to the American Film Institute. I worked in the entertainment industry, and I have my master's from the American Film Institute in film production and writing. And I I'll never forget in the story development classes, they would say, everybody has a story to tell, not everyone should tell it. And I just disagree with that so much. To me, we all have to tell our stories. That's how we connect. That's how we
Yes.
know each other. That's how we end this feeling of being isolated and separate. We're not separate. We are all connected. And if we're not sharing our stories, who are we?
I mean, our ancestors were doing that round campfires and, I mean,
Oh,
exactly.
oh,
And
I'm
aren't we mesmerized when people start sharing a story? I mean, we all come around and pull up a chair and we
yes,
eavesdrop. What are
yes,
people saying? We love stories. We're consumed by them.
yes,
And my
yes.
goodness, don't we need some inspirational stories? Um, there's a huge market out there, so go
Well,
and share
no,
them.
we need stories of hope.
Yes.
We need stories of positive reactions. I don't know what your headlines are like there, but our headlines, I can't read the news anymore. I can't even just go and look at headlines. They're
Yeah.
just selling papers because they come up with these sensational things. And
Yeah.
it's designed to get you scared and buying things. And it's like, no, I'm not buying that. No,
Yeah.
I have websites that are about good news and great things that are going on in the world. That's what I want to focus my
Yeah.
attention. You
Oh,
know,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it can be the simplest of things I mean, one of the things that I have found is a passion for gardening. I just didn't know, but I can go outside and I can marvel at the fact that I planted the seed and in just, a week or so, it's growing and every day. I mean, we don't recognize or we've forgotten, I think, the incredible beauty and to become mesmerized at the most simplest of things, the beauty of a color of a bloom, in spring. And I know that you guys are coming to spring. And I share that because it's like storytelling. I think we've forgotten the art of that.
yeah.
And the art of a good book. Like we were watching a movie yesterday, and it was just a simple movie, but the storytelling in that and had multiple kind of stories. And my husband looked at me and goes, "Why are you smiling?" I literally was smiling because this is such a great story. I was marveling in the story of the story. And we love stories. We love stories. And the beautiful thing is, we've got technology now that doesn't cost thousands of dollars. We just can pick up our devices, record, little stories that become the big stories, and we're able to share that. So we
Yeah.
don't have the excuse of, "Oh, I don't have the big microphones and all of that." You don't need that.
No,
Just,
and we don't need to have like epic stories. Epic
no,
stories. When people say, "Oh, my story isn't that big of a deal," is it important to you? Well, yeah, then it's important to the rest of us.
yeah.
That's
And
how
here's
we
the
know
thing, what you
you.
just said, Carrie, I think, which is just so important. And I'm sure you share with your clients too. If they are passionate about it and interested in it and are sharing it, that passion, there are some storytellers that could tell a story about going to the shops and buying something, the way they share it, it like
Yeah.
a good author, you read a book and the words that they've selected and woven together is just, you could see yourself there. You can hear the sound if they're talking about a cafe. That's about the good storyteller, isn't it? It's delivery
Yes,
of story.
yes, yes,
But
yes,
when you're
yes,
passionate and when it's you, you
yes,
can't fake yourself or your own
yes,
story because you've lived it, and
yes,
that
yes,
comes through.
yes. Ah, oh, you are delightful, and I've taken more of your time than I thought, but you're just delightful. I could share stories with you for hours. So let's get a campfire going and we'll put it in the middle of a Zoom call and get a bunch of people around and share stories. That would
Ah,
be delightful, just delightful. I can't thank you enough, Anne-Marie. Thank you. And I'm going to sign up for your podcast and return the favor. I'd love to. And I would love to keep you posted on my progress with bringing more stories out to the world. And anytime you need anything, do not hesitate to reach out to me. I mean that. I want to know all your stories. You've got so many great ones.
thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, Kerry. And I cannot wait to have you share some of your stories on our podcast too, because I know that that is certainly going to inspire hope, possibility to others as well. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Hey, it's Annemarie. Before I go, are you a coach or a consultant who feels like the world's best kept secret? Your experience is vast, yet secretly you're frustrated because despite all of your hard work, you're just not getting the visibility, leads, or new clients you'd hope for, and you don't know why? I've created free training and resources that'll help you build visibility, generate leads, and enroll dream clients with ease because you're seen as a trusted authority, even in a crowded marketplace. And you've positioned yourself as the choice versus just a choice with your unique, uncopyable, and unforgettable brand and message. And you're able to nurture listeners into leads from your podcast, even from your first episode. To access these free resources, go to ambitiousentrepreneurnetwork.com/community. That's ambitiousentrepreneurnetwork.com/community.